I never thought a quiet day fishing would turn into a full-on police incident. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't breaking any law. I was sitting on the edge of a lake, casting my line like I've done for years. The water was still, the breeze was light, and everything felt peaceful until the HOA board decided to stir things up. They came marching over, clipboards in hand, looking like they were about to evict a criminal. Only problem? I wasn't one. One of them, a woman I'd only ever seen glaring from her golf cart, pointed right at me and said, "You can't fish here. This is HOA property." I blinked. I looked around. I was standing on my own land I'd owned for years. And the lake? Well, that's where things get interesting. I didn't argue, not yet. I just said, "Pretty sure I can." That didn't go over well. She scoffed, muttered something into her walkie-talkie like she was in a spy movie, and stormed off. I thought it was over. I figured she just wanted to flex her little badge of power and would move on. I didn't expect her to call the police. But within 15 minutes, sure enough, a sheriff's car rolled down the gravel path and stopped near the lake. The officer stepped out slow, hand resting casually near his belt, scanning the area like he'd walked into a drug bust. The HOA board followed him like they'd summoned a higher power. The same woman pointed again. "That's him," she said, like I was some wanted man. "He's fishing illegally. He doesn't have permission. This is common property, and he's been warned." I could tell the cop was trying to hide how annoyed he was. He walked over, calm and polite, and asked me what I was doing. I said, "Fishing." He asked if I lived here. I said, "Yes." He asked if I had permission to be on this land. That's when I reached into my tackle box, pulled out a folder, and handed him a copy of the documents I'd been keeping ready for just such an occasion. See, this wasn't the first time the HOA had tried to mess with me. But this time I was ready. I had done my homework. I handed over the papers showing the lake bordered my property, and more importantly, that I owned the water rights, not the HOA, not the neighborhood association. Me. The officer flipped through the documents, his eyebrows rising slightly. He nodded slowly, then turned to the board and said, "Looks like he's in the clear." You could feel the mood shift. The HOA folks went from smug to confused in seconds. One of them asked to see the documents themselves. The officer said no, unless I wanted to share. I didn't. They huddled like they were trying to figure out a new plan. Maybe a loophole. Maybe some other rule to twist. But there wasn't one. I just sat there calm, quiet, still holding my fishing rod. The sun was shining. The water was calm. And the fish? They didn't seem to care about HOA politics either. The cop gave me a small nod and said, "Enjoy your afternoon." Then he turned and walked back to his car. The HOA stood frozen, unsure whether to argue or retreat. I didn't say a word to them. I just smiled, looked back at the lake, and cast my line again. What they didn't know was that this lake had been part of a land deal I'd made years ago. And with that land came full rights to the water, something very few property owners get. Most people assume the HOA controls everything, but that's not always true. Some things are protected by law, not board meetings. Some things can't be taken with a vote, and that's where it all started. A simple fishing trip turned into a standoff, but I wasn't worried. I knew the facts, and the HOA, well, they were about to learn them the hard way. It all started when I bought this piece of land on the edge of town, a quiet place with open skies and a lake that stretched just beyond the back fence. I didn't buy it for prestige. I didn't buy it to impress anyone. I bought it because I needed peace, space, and something real, something that couldn't be micromanaged by a committee or interrupted by someone measuring grass height. At first, everything was perfect. I spent mornings with a cup of coffee, watching the mist rise off the water. Evenings were for fishing, just me and the sounds of nature. That lake wasn't just a body of water. It became a part of my routine, my peace, my home. I fixed up the old dock, cleared the overgrowth, and started planting a few trees near the shore. It wasn't long before the area started looking less like a forgotten pond and more like a private retreat. That's when the HOA started sniffing around. Now, when I bought the property, the development down the road hadn't yet expanded. My lake sat comfortably outside their mapped jurisdiction. But as their new phases of homes were built, their little empire began creeping closer to my land. One day I saw a small sign go up near the road. HOA zone begins here. I thought nothing of it at the time. I wasn't in their zone. My property deed made that clear. But it turns out they had other ideas. The first time they approached me, it was under the guise of neighborly outreach. A man named Roger, button-up shirt, khakis, sunglasses tucked into his collar, knocked on my door and introduced himself as the HOA president. He spoke with a strange kind of friendliness, like he was selling me something he already assumed I wanted. "We're looking to integrate the lake area into our community space," he said. "Picnics, canoe rentals, maybe a nice trail around the edge." I just blinked at him. "The lake's on my land," I said flatly. "I'm not interested." Roger chuckled awkwardly, like I had misunderstood. "Technically," he said, "it's part of the natural watershed shared by the development. It's common use water. You'd still live here, of course, but we'd manage the upkeep." I said no again, firmer this time. I had no interest in kids screaming by the water, homeowners complaining about bugs, or a bunch of signs going up telling me what I could and couldn't do on land I paid for. Roger left, and I figured that would be the end of it. But I was wrong. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. HOA branded, of course. They were formally requesting I stop making changes to the shoreline. Apparently planting trees and setting up my own dock now violated some environmental beautification policy. I laughed when I read it. That policy had nothing to do with me. But they didn't stop. More letters came. One accused me of unauthorized use of community resources. Another said my fishing activities were disturbing the ecosystem and surrounding residents. Then came the threats of fines, ridiculous amounts, too. Hundreds of dollars a day if I didn't comply. But here's the thing. I didn't live in the HOA. I wasn't a member. I didn't sign anything. My land was never part of their plans. I had bought it long before their blueprints reached this far. But that didn't seem to matter to them. They acted like the lake gave them power, like water gave them control. They started showing up at random times. I'd catch them walking along the fence line with clipboards and cameras. One morning, I saw someone with a drone flying low over the lake. That's when I knew they were getting desperate. Still, I didn't say much. I just kept fishing. I kept maintaining my land. And every time they got more aggressive, I quietly added another folder to the growing stack of documents I was collecting. Land surveys, deeds, water rights papers, legal opinions. If they wanted to fight, I was preparing for it the smart way. I knew they thought they were untouchable. They'd gotten used to pushing people around, handing out rules like they were law. But the thing about power is, it only works if the other person doesn't know their rights. And I knew mine very well. It was a Saturday morning when they finally decided to take things further. The sky was clear, the lake looked like glass, and I was out there early, same as always, casting my line in silence. I had barely been out there 20 minutes when I noticed them, 4 HOA board members, walking in a slow line toward me like I'd summoned them. Roger was in the lead again, this time wearing a reflective vest for some reason, probably to make himself look official. I stayed seated. I didn't say a word, just kept my hand on the fishing rod and watched them come closer. The woman who had called the cops last time was back too. She had a folder in her hands and a look on her face, like she was about to deliver a court sentence. Roger cleared his throat like he wanted to grab the attention of a whole room, not just one person sitting by the water. "Sir," he began, like we hadn't already spoken dozens of times, "you are in direct violation of community rules. This lake is considered shared property now, and your continued interference puts you at risk of enforcement action." I looked up at him, slow and steady, and said nothing. The woman stepped in. "We've given you plenty of chances. You're ignoring notices. You're damaging what could be a valuable feature for the neighborhood. We've made it clear this lake is no longer under private use." I finally stood up, calm, quiet, not a twitch of anger. I said, "You've made a lot of things clear, none of them legal." Roger scoffed. "We've already spoken to the city council. There's precedent for this. You're just being stubborn." That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording. Not because I needed to threaten them. I just knew they behaved differently when a camera was rolling. The change was instant. Their posture shifted. The woman held her folder tighter. Roger narrowed his eyes. "Do you really want to make this a bigger issue than it has to be?" he asked, voice quieter now. "You're the ones making it an issue," I said. "I live here. I own this land. And I own the rights to that water. I've told you that, and you've ignored it." They stood there for a moment, saying nothing. Then Roger nodded to someone behind him, and the man in the back, quiet until now, pulled out his phone and stepped away. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard sirens. Again, HOA had called the police. Again, I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, phone in one hand, fishing rod in the other. And when the deputy stepped out of his car, I smiled, not because I was happy to see him, but because this time I knew exactly who he was. We'd spoken once before. He had been at a town meeting about land use, and we'd ended up chatting after the session. His name was Deputy Lane, and when he saw me, his eyes lit up with recognition. "Morning," he said, walking over, casual as ever. "Everything all right?" Roger didn't wait. He jumped in like he was presenting a case in court. "Deputy, this man is trespassing on HOA-managed property. He refuses to follow posted rules and continues to disturb the area even after formal notice." Lane glanced at me. Then he looked around the lake. "You're saying this is HOA-managed?" "Yes," Roger insisted. "As of last year's vote, we've extended usage rights over the lake. It's part of the plan to include natural features in our community amenities." Lane turned to me. "You got any paperwork with you today?" I didn't say a word. I just reached into the tackle box, pulled out the folder I kept there now, and handed it to him. Deed copy, survey map, the official county record showing I own the land bordering the lake, and more importantly, the document that gave me full rights to the water, usage, maintenance, everything. Lane took a few minutes reading it. The silence was sharp. The HOA board stood in place, eyes bouncing between him and me, waiting for some ruling in their favor. But Lane finally looked up, handed me back the papers, and turned to them. "Yeah, you've got no claim here," he said calmly. "He's within his rights. Water and land are his. Your HOA boundaries don't apply." The board was stunned. I could almost hear the cracks in their confidence forming. Roger opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but didn't have the words. The silence after Deputy Lane's words was so heavy, you could hear the lake water lapping gently against the shore. Roger's jaw twitched like he was chewing on frustration. The woman next to him, still clutching her folder, looked like someone had pulled the rug out from under her. And the other two board members? They just stood there, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. I gave Lane a nod of appreciation. He didn't need to say anything else. He had done what no one else had so far, cut through the noise with facts. The HOA had no claim. Not on the lake. Not on the shoreline. Not on a single inch of my land. But of course, Roger wasn't the type to back off gracefully. He took one more step forward, keeping his voice lower this time, like maybe he thought that would make it sound more official. "Well," he muttered, "there are still environmental concerns. Fishing that often can have a negative impact on the natural balance of the lake. We may have to raise the issue with the county environmental department." I raised my eyebrows and smiled. "Do it," I said. "Let them come. I already have the reports. Clean water, stable fish population, no restricted species. I've been maintaining this lake better than anyone ever did before me." He didn't answer that. He couldn't, because it was true. The only reason that lake even looked good enough for them to want it was because I had spent time, energy, and money making sure it stayed healthy. Before I moved in, the lake was mostly ignored, filled with overgrowth, and surrounded by trash from nearby construction. I'd been the one clearing it, restoring the shore, planting trees to prevent erosion. And now they wanted to tell me how to care for it? Deputy Lane turned to them again, his tone firm now. "I'm not coming back out here every weekend for something like this. He's not breaking any laws. This is private property. This isn't a community park. If you keep using law enforcement to push HOA boundaries, it's going to be considered harassment. That hit harder than any fishing rod could. The board members started to backpedal, literally. They took small steps away, mumbling excuses about misunderstandings and just doing their job. I stood there with my rod still in hand, not saying much, just letting the silence speak louder than any words. They didn't apologize. People like that rarely do, but they didn't argue anymore either. That was enough for me. I watched them turn and walk away, a little slower, a little less proud than when they had arrived. Their faces said it all. They weren't used to being told no. And now, they'd been told by the one person they thought they could push around. Lane gave me a small wave and started heading back to his vehicle. Just before getting in, he turned and said, "Nice spot you got here. Might need to come back sometime when I'm not on duty." "You're welcome any time," I told him. And just like that, the tension broke. The breeze picked up again. A fish jumped in the distance. I sat back down, picked up my coffee from the tackle box, and cast my line again like nothing had ever happened. But the truth was, something had changed. Not just for me, but for them too. The board had finally learned that I wasn't just some stubborn homeowner standing in their way. I wasn't someone they could intimidate with forms or letters. I was the legal landowner, the rightful holder of the water rights. And more than that, I was someone who did his homework. They were used to people folding when they flashed authority. But I had stared them down, calmly, legally, and without ever raising my voice. After that day, things got quiet. No more letters. No more drones. No more early morning visits with measuring tape and clipboards. They didn't come near the lake again. Not because they respected me, necessarily, but because they knew better. They'd pushed too far and finally hit a wall they couldn't climb. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw a party or brag to neighbors. I just went back to what I loved. Fishing, peace and quiet, the lake, my land, everything I had worked for, protected by a few pieces of paper and the will to stand firm when it counted. A few days after the standoff at the lake, I noticed something strange. There was a car parked across from my property, just sitting there. No one got out. No one came to the door. It stayed for maybe 30 minutes, then drove off. I didn't think much of it at first. But then it happened again the next day. And the day after that, same car, same time, just watching. I figure it was someone from the HOA trying to get more evidence. Maybe they were hoping I'd do something they could twist into another complaint. But I wasn't going to give them anything. I went about my day like I always did. Worked in the garden. Took care of the land. Went fishing in the evening. But I made sure to keep my phone close. I started documenting everything, just in case. A week later, I finally approached the car. It was the same make and model every time, just with a different driver. This one looked young, maybe a college intern or someone fresh out of school. I walked up calmly and tapped on a window. He jumped like he'd seen a ghost. "You watching the birds or the water?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He fumbled a bit and said he was doing a neighborhood wildlife survey. I nodded, then pointed out there were no neighborhood signs on this road, and that this stretch, including the lake, was all private. My land. He tried to laugh it off and said he'd move along, and sure enough, he did. But it wasn't hard to figure out who sent him. The HOA was still digging, still looking for a way in. If they couldn't take the lake by vote, and they couldn't find me into submission, maybe they were hoping I'd mess up somewhere along the line. But I didn't, because I already knew how this game worked. I'd seen it happen to others in nearby developments. Homeowners pushed into silence, bullied by letters, threats, or vague legal talk. Some gave in. Some sold their homes. A few even went to court. But most didn't know they had power, too. That if they knew what was actually in their deed, in the town records, or state laws, they could fight back. I wasn't about to let anyone rewrite the rules on land I legally owned. So I made a decision. I printed a few large signs and posted them around the entrance to the lake path. Private property. No trespassing. Surveillance in use. I didn't add any angry messages. Just the facts. Plain and clear. 2 days later, I got an email. Not a letter this time. not a visit. It came from the HOA's legal consultant, who I didn't even know existed until that moment. The email sounded polite, but the message was the same. They were requesting a friendly discussion about shared environmental responsibilities. A classic tactic. No threats, but plenty of pressure disguised as cooperation. I didn't respond right away. I forwarded the email to my own lawyer instead, a local guy who knew the property boundaries well and had already helped me navigate the water rights registration when I bought the place. He read it, laughed, and said, "They're fishing now and not in your lake." But what really caught my attention came a few days later. A flyer went out to all homes in the HOA district. Someone forwarded me a copy. It said they were seeking input on a proposal to revise boundary lines and include new shared use spaces. They even added a blurry image of the lake, with no mention of the fact that it wasn't theirs to touch. No mention of the private ownership. Just vague wording and community-friendly buzzwords. It was clear what they were doing, trying to reframe the story. Make it sound like they were building something together, not taking something away. Like the lake was just a natural extension of the neighborhood, rather than what it truly was, someone else's hard-earned land. But the thing is, no amount of friendly flyers or soft-spoken emails could change the facts. I had the papers, the legal titles, the land surveys. I'd even gone so far as to register the water rights with the state's online system, just so they were easily accessible and time-stamped. If they wanted to take this fight higher, I was ready. I wasn't angry. I was prepared. It didn't take long before word started spreading through the neighborhood. A few of the newer homeowners, the ones who didn't know the history, started showing up near the edge of my land. Some came with curiosity, others with questions. One guy even brought his kid and a fishing rod, thinking the lake was now a public spot. I walked out to greet him, calm and polite, and explained that this lake wasn't part of the HOA's recreational zone. He looked confused, said he'd been told it was open to all residents. I didn't blame him. He was just listening to what the flyers said. I showed him the private property marker and pointed to the boundary. "This is all mine," I told him, right up to the water line, and including the water itself. His eyebrows shot up. "Wait, you own the lake?" I nodded. "Yep, including the water rights. Got the paperwork to prove it." He apologized, packed up his rod, and left without complaint. That's how most people were once they heard the truth. The problem wasn't the residents. It was the HOA board spinning their story like they had more control than they really did. A few days later, I decided to take a quiet walk down the gravel trail by the lake, just to clear my head. About halfway down, I noticed someone standing near the edge, right at the property line. Clipboard in hand, camera around their neck, and a sour expression like they just swallowed something bitter. It was one of the board members, the same guy who usually kept quiet in the background during their little ambushes. This time, he was alone, and from the look on his face, he wasn't thrilled to see me. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked up beside him and looked out over the lake. "You all still trying to claim this place?" I asked casual. He didn't look at me, just stared out at the water. "We're trying to make the neighborhood better," he said. "Families want access to the lake. They want to fish, swim, maybe kayak. You're the only one stopping that." I shrugged. "You ever think it's because it doesn't belong to the neighborhood?" He turned toward me, face stiff. "Maybe it should." That made me pause. There it was, not hidden in polite letters or watered-down emails. Just the truth. Maybe it should. That was the mindset I've been dealing with all along. Not law, not fact, just entitlement. "Well," I said, still calm, "wanting something doesn't make it yours. And voting on something you don't own doesn't make it legal." He didn't argue. He just shook his head and walked off. And something about that moment stuck with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. The HOA didn't just want access to the lake. They wanted control. Control over how it was used. Who could use it? When? For what purpose? And that control didn't come from laws or property lines. It came from people not knowing how to push back. Later that week, I got another surprise. This time, it wasn't a car watching from the road. It was a certified letter delivered to my mailbox. The board was requesting a formal mediation session to resolve the ongoing lake access dispute. They even included a list of suggested compromises, including community hours and shared maintenance responsibilities. I took it straight to my lawyer. He looked it over and raised an eyebrow. "They're still pretending they have a say," he said. "This isn't mediation. This is pressure." We crafted a response that was short, direct, and backed with legal citations. I had no obligation to enter any kind of mediation. There was no legal dispute. There was only their assumption that they could rewrite reality with enough signatures or nicely worded documents. From that moment on, I decided to be even more proactive. I printed and laminated a copy of the property boundary map and mounted it at the trail's entrance. I added a second sign next to the dock: "Privately owned lake. No public access. Violators will be prosecuted." Not in an aggressive way, just facts. And just like that, the traffic around the lake started to slow. No more HOA members lurking around. No more surprise visitors. Just me, my land, and the peace I had earned. A week after things had finally quieted down, I got a knock on my front door. It wasn't Roger this time. It wasn't the clipboard crew or someone trying to hand me another letter. It was a man I hadn't seen before, middle-aged, dressed in jeans and a clean button-up. He introduced himself as Nathan, a new homeowner who had recently moved into the neighborhood with his wife and 2 kids. "I heard you're the guy who owns the lake," he said with a nervous chuckle. "Figured I'd come to you directly instead of listening to all the board gossip." That caught my attention. "What are they saying now?" I asked, stepping out onto the porch. He shrugged. "Depends on who you ask. Some say you're refusing to let people enjoy the lake. Others say you're suing the HOA. One guy even claimed you built a fence with electric wiring to keep kids out." I laughed. I hadn't even built a fence, let alone an electric one. Nathan went on. "Honestly, I don't care about all that. I just wanted to know what's the real deal here. Are people allowed to use a lake or not?" I appreciated the honesty. It was rare. I explained everything to him in plain terms. The property lines, the water rights, the way the HOA tried to twist it all into something it wasn't. I told him about the fishing, the fake complaints, the police showing up. I didn't exaggerate or add drama. I just laid out the truth. By the end of it, he nodded slowly. "That makes a lot more sense now. Honestly, I wish they had just been upfront. They make it sound like you're some villain who won't share his toys." I smiled. "That's because it's easier for them to say I'm the problem than admit they don't have control." Nathan stayed for a while. We talked about the area, the HOA's overreach, even how he was already getting fined for minor things like leaving his trash bin out an hour too long. He said he felt like he was walking on eggshells since the day he moved in. I wasn't surprised. Before he left, he asked, "If I wanted to fish sometime, just me and my boy, is there a way we could work something out?" I told him sure, as long as he respected the land and didn't invite the entire neighborhood. I wasn't trying to be mean. I just didn't want my property turned into a community park without my say. After that, word must have gotten around. Quietly this time, I started noticing more people knocking on my door, not to argue, but to talk. A couple wanted to know if they could walk around the lake trail occasionally. Another man asked if he could photograph the birds along the shoreline for his nature blog. One woman, probably in her 60s, offered to help clean up trash around the perimeter if it ever piled up. None of them came demanding anything. None waved HOA papers in my face. They came with respect, and in return, I gave them honesty. I realized something important then. Most of the tension wasn't coming from the people. It was coming from the board. The residents were just caught in the middle, told one story, sold one narrative, and many of them, especially the newer ones, didn't know how much power the HOA really didn't have. So I started being more vocal, not aggressive, not loud, just informative. I spoke at a town hall meeting when they opened the floor to property owners. I brought copies of the water rights and property boundaries. I explained how the HOA couldn't govern land it didn't own. And when I spoke, people listened, not because I shouted, but because I spoke with facts. The board didn't like it. You could see it on their faces. Roger tried to interrupt me twice, saying it wasn't the appropriate time to discuss private matters. But someone from the back stood up and said, "It affects everyone. It's worth talking about." That got a small round of applause. Not wild cheering, just quiet agreement, which was more than enough. By the time the meeting ended, a few board members avoided eye contact as they left. Roger didn't say a word to me, but several neighbors came up and thanked me, not for keeping them off the lake, but for finally clearing up what the board had been hiding all along. It had been nearly a month since the HOA last tried to make a move, and for the most part, things had settled into a strange sort of calm. I still fished most evenings, and the lake looked better than ever. The water was clear. The trees I planted had started filling out, and the trail I built down to the shore had packed itself into a neat little footpath. The land felt like it belonged again, not just legally, but peacefully. But even with things quiet on the surface, I knew the board hadn't completely given up. I started noticing subtle changes. The HOA's community bulletin, which usually had gardening tips or reminders about recycling, now had little notes tucked in. Phrases like lost access to natural resources and property rights confusion started appearing. They never named me, but anyone paying attention could tell what they were talking about. It was a soft campaign meant to stir sympathy and resentment without crossing any obvious lines. And I'll be honest, part of me wanted to ignore it. Let it fade. Let them stew in their disappointment while I lived my life. But another part of me, the part that had spent months being pushed, lied to, and threatened, wasn't ready to just sit back. So I filed a formal letter with the county, requesting a public statement of clarification regarding my property and water rights. It wasn't just for me, it was for everyone else who had been misled. Within a week, the county issued a response confirming that the lake and surrounding land were privately owned, not subject to HOA governance, and protected under the existing title and water rights agreements. They posted the statement online and included a copy in their monthly community update. That changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't the guy the HOA could label as selfish or aggressive. Now I was just a landowner, following the law, standing up for what was his. The county had made it official. There was no gray area left to spin or twist, and the effect on the neighborhood was immediate. People started stopping me on my way into town. One woman from 3 streets over flagged me down just to say she had voted in favor of the HOA proposal to expand the shared spaces without realizing they were targeting private land. "I'm sorry," she said. "We weren't given all the facts." I told her it was okay. I knew how easy it was to fall for official-sounding words and pretty pictures. It wasn't her fault the board had tried to reshape reality. Even the younger couple who had once let their dog run around near my dock came by to apologize. They brought a bag of coffee beans from a local shop and said they respected the land now more than ever. That kind of gesture might not seem big, but it mattered. It reminded me that most people aren't the problem. It's usually just a few trying to control many. Then one afternoon, as I was walking back up from the lake, I saw something that made me pause. A for sale sign had popped up in front of Roger's house. At first, I thought maybe he was just upgrading, moving somewhere else in the neighborhood. But a closer look showed it was a full relocation. He was leaving the development entirely. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile or brag. I just watched as, over the next week, moving trucks came and went. Roger didn't knock on my door. He didn't try to clear the air, and I didn't expect him to. Some people leave without ever admitting they were wrong. That's just how it goes. But I did notice something else. After Roger left, the tone of the HOA changed. Their next newsletter was softer. No more talk of resource expansion. Instead, it focused on community gardening and spring cleanup. The tension dropped. Fewer people were patrolling around the lake. No more board members with clipboards. No strange cars parked across the street. And while I wasn't naive enough to believe it was over for good, I finally felt like I could breathe again, like the lake and the life I built around it could go back to being what it always was, a peaceful place, earned through patience, not submission,